Hi, good afternoon. I'm Heidi Pidcoke, and I really want to welcome you to our webinar today. I'm here with Adam Kane, who's off to my right, and we're excited to present this webinar on stress and self-care. The material that we're presenting today was created within a consortium that includes UNITAR and includes an organization called the Global Initiative for Stress and Trauma Treatment, which is what I've been working with for almost a year. And at the end, when we say goodbye, I'll give you the email address for them as well as my email address if you want to get more contact, more information about what we discussed today. So as we're getting settled in, I'd love for you to give me your name and the country that you're in, and one thing that you're hoping to learn in our time today. So in today's webinar, we're exploring the causes, the impact of stress, and we're looking at the continuum of stress symptoms. I'll be highlighting the importance of recognizing, assessing, and managing stress, and we'll look at what stress does to our bodies and specifically to our brains. We'll finish today by focusing on elements of self-care. In our next webinar on June 27th, which is a month from today, we'll cover causes and the impact of trauma and learn strategies on how to increase resilience. I'm a trauma therapist. I've been working as a therapist since 1995, and I've also been focusing on somatic psychology, which is body-oriented psychology, and family systems. So if you could write in your name and the country you're in and what you're hoping to learn, just one thing, in today's webinar, that would be great. Thanks. So, what is stress? We use this word a lot. I'm stressed, she's stressed. So before we start our discussion, I'd like you to take a second and write down, how do you define stress? And I'll read some of your answers in a little while. So Adam's going to just put that question up on the screen. What is your definition of stress? If you could write that down and send that in, I'd really appreciate it. Somebody at Headington Institute, which is a really great organization, which I encourage you to Google, defines stress as any demand or change that the human system, that's the mind, the body, and the spirit, is required to meet and respond to. So stress is a part of normal life. Without the challenges and the physical demands, life would be actually quite boring. So stress, however, causes distress. It's way too distressing if it lasts too long, it happens too often, or is too severe. One of the things that I like to look at is this visual of the continuum of stress, which Adam will put on the screen right now. It's called the Yerkes-Dodson stress curve. There it is. So let's look at that slide. If you look on the left in the green zone, when you have absolutely no stress in your life, you're often inactive and bored. You're lethargic. Sometimes your mind is sluggish. You don't pretty much get anything done. As your stress level goes up, your performance goes up, and you feel motivated, you get focused, and there's a sweet spot where there's a peak performance. But if the stress continues, then your performance starts to get down, and you start getting tired and then exhausted, and then you start having a lot of different emotions like anger and anxiety or guilt or panic. And it impacts your immune system, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. And then right at the edge of this continuum is where you're headed towards burnout and breakdown. So this is a really good visual that I want to keep in mind as we keep on talking. All living systems are designed to have periods of activity and periods of rest. So when this natural cycle is out of balance, our bodies and our minds experience either extremes on that stress curve. We either are completely lethargic and don't do anything, or we're heading towards burnout and sometimes breakdown. But when we're in a place of balance, we're in that yellow zone, if you remember, of the stress curve, we tend to have a sense of hope and optimism and that things are going well. All change is stressful, but not all stress is negative. There is such a thing as positive stress. And what happens when we experience positive stress, like on that stress curve, we improve our performance, we feel motivated, it focuses our energy and our resources, we feel excited, we feel a sense of reward, and we also feel like it's right in the place of what we can manage. It's just on the edge of our capacities. And sometimes it's really good to push ourselves that way. So let's think of some examples of what we do, what we choose in our lives that is stressful, but that we actually invite. So I'm thinking of some examples like we ask for a promotion in our work, or we start a new relationship, we get married, we become a parent, which is not short-term but incredibly rewarding. We move house, or we sign up for something like running a marathon. Can you think of some other examples of things that you've done to invite something that's actually stressful into your life that has caused you stress but is actually really positive? So if you want to, please send those in, but we'd like to hear from you if you can. Going back to the stress curve, as we think about the orange and the red zones, the challenges, the demands, the threats, or the changes that we experience can often exceed what we know that we can cope with. So we start feeling overwhelmed and we're unable to function. At that point, our thoughts are rooted in a sense of helplessness and hopelessness. I want to say that it's important to not generalize with stress. What's distressful for one person is not really necessarily distressful for another person. So in my life, I was born and raised in Brazil. I lived in the States. I moved to South Africa in my 30s. I lived in Kenya for 8 years, and now I'm living in Europe. So that's a lot of moves. And for a lot of people that I've met, that's just normal. Picking up and moving to a different country every 2 to 3 years, even when they have little kids, feels like, yeah, this is exciting. I get to experience a new culture. Other people that I've met who would think about a lifestyle of moving would be horrified. They would find that so distressing because they feel a sense of place. They feel a deep sense of belonging. They have a sense of identity in their rootedness, and they could not cope with that level of movement, of being nomads. The other thing about stress is that we also have a sense of not being able to be consistent within ourselves in terms of what is distressing. So at certain times, something won't bother me, won't cause distress. At another times, it will. So if we stay with this example of moving. So say you're wanting to move house and you've had your eye on this beautiful home in this neighborhood that you love. There's lots of trees. It's a good school system. And just before you put your house or your place up on the market, you fall and you break your ankle. And at that point, you think, okay, can I actually make this move? Can I actually go through this? Because you can't really move all those boxes, and maybe the new place has lots of stairs, without getting some movers in, and that would be a whole extra cost. So it might move from something that's within your coping resources and into the place where you're really distressed, and you may choose to put your plans on hold. So that's something to note, that you can't count on what is distressful and what is stressful in one moment, because that changes from time to time. So now I'd like you guys to do a little exercise. I'd like you to think about 5 things that you're currently finding stressful in your life. You don't have to write those in, but just write them down, and we're going to refer to those later on. So I'm going to take just a few seconds to let you write 5 things that you are currently finding stressful in your life. So I just want to read one of the participants is excited to know more about stress on the body and maybe how to use the body to combat stress. Thank you, Carolina. All right. The next slide that Adam's going to show you is called the Life Change Index Scale. And I just want to show this to you because it's well known in the field of psychology that positive things can also cause stress. So if we look at that scale, we see in the top 15 or so items that some really lovely things, some really wonderful positive things are actually quite stressful. So if you look at marriage has a score of 50 on the Life Change Index Scale, which is called the stress test. Retirement, which can also be a really positive thing, is in there. Getting pregnant is in there. Having a new member in your family, so adopting or having a child, is in there. So a lot of positive things cause stress just as much as negative things. But we don't often say, oh, I'm really stressed because, I've reconciliated with my spouse, which is also in there. But so let's talk about how we refer to stress, right? When we say we are stressed, we're talking about things that normally happen in our day-to-day lives. So we're not getting along with somebody in our family or somebody at work. Our commute is getting to us. We're having financial troubles. We're either sick ourselves or somebody that we love is sick, but not with something life-threatening. It could be changes in a day-to-day environment, like you have a job promotion like we were talking about and a new office, and so your routine is changed. And all of these changes will create stress, but that stress decreases after the first few weeks of that new routine, or when the illness is over, or when the argument is settled. And in most circumstances, stressful situations are very easily managed by us, and if we need help, we tend to reach out for our peers, our colleagues, our friends, our family, and so most stress is manageable. I want to briefly mention this really nice concept called a window of tolerance, and somebody in the UNITAR graphics team drew this for me. I don't know if you can see it. So a window of tolerance is talking about the fact that when things are mostly manageable, we are within our window of tolerance. We're within that window. But when things get really hectic, when things get beyond what we think we can cope with, we come up above this window into a place where we get either in fight or flight mode, which is called hyperarousal, or we're below the window and into a hypoarousal, or we're freezing, or we're numbing, a sense of collapse, and that window gets smaller and smaller. One example that I like to give is, think about if you're driving. Maybe not all of you drive, but if you're driving and you have people talking and you're also playing the radio and you're trying to navigate, but the streets are fairly familiar. That's how you would feel. You're driving a car, you're having to navigate things, but it's fairly within your normal capacities. But say it starts hailing all of a sudden, and the road starts getting really, really slick. What's the very first thing that you're going to do? You're probably going to stop listening to the conversations around you, and you're going to turn off the radio, and you're going to slow down, because then you're going into this zone of being kind of hyper aroused because things feel less manageable. So that's a kind of a day-to-day example, but those things also happen like when you have somebody close to you die, or you go through a divorce, or there's a natural disaster like a flood or an earthquake, or and your coping mechanisms get exhausted. Your window of tolerance gets much, much narrower, and it's likely that you'll experience reactions which are in the fight or flight, or in the freeze or collapse or numbing mode. And we're going to talk a lot more about this in the next webinar on June 27th. Some of you actually may work in situations of ongoing stress, such as in places where there have been crises or armed conflict, where there's long-term impacts of natural disasters. Too many stressors, like we said, happening too often, or that are too intense, means that it's likely that you're suffering from cumulative or chronic stress. So what causes cumulative stress? Let's just go through some of the things that would leave you in a chronic state of stress. One of the biggest elements would be a sense of powerlessness. When you feel that things are out of your control, we as humans don't do very well in that kind of situation. We also don't do well in situations where we get intermittent negative feedback and criticism. Why do I say intermittent? Because if somebody is always unhappy with what you're doing, after a while you can say, like, I'm just going to tune that person out because I'm never going to please them. But if you get intermittent, if somebody every so often says, like, ooh, not very nice what you just did, or I didn't like that, or, they criticize you, there's this part of us that keeps wanting to please them or to get them to say nice things about us. People who've studied psychology know this as the reward impulse. The other things that cause cumulative stress are not being able to meet the demands that are placed on you, like when your workload is really, really too heavy, way beyond what you can manage. Poor communication, if you're having frequent arguments or not able to resolve things with your boss at your work, or colleagues or family members. Oftentimes also when you have a long time where you don't have basic creature comforts, like, you don't have a bed to sleep in, or you don't have something that would, that you kind of depend on to take care of yourself, like exercise, then that would also cause cumulative stress. The other thing is if you have a very decreased or limited ability to rest or relax because you don't give it to yourself or you're not given it. All of those cause cumulative stress. The key to identifying cumulative stress is changes in an individual's thinking, feelings, sensations, beliefs, and behaviors. Yeah? So I want to say that again. If you see any change in your or somebody around you's thinking, feeling, sensations, beliefs, and behaviors, it's really a great way to understand if they're suffering or you're suffering from chronic or cumulative stress. So let's look at a case example. I'm going to read this out to you, but I'm also going to put it on the screen so that you can read it. The case example. 17 months ago, Luis, who's a 31-year-old Brazilian physical therapist, moved his young family to Luanda, Angola. His dream of working with an international NGO was realized. It had come true, and he was excited about the possibility of helping those whose bodies and lives had been damaged by landmines. However, his supervisor had been critical of how he conducts his intake interviews with the landmine victims. After several months of work, Luis felt he wanted someone to talk to about the horrific stories he was hearing. 3 weeks ago, he noticed certain symptoms when he thought of asking his supervisor to take time off to look after his young son after his wife got whiplash from being rear-ended by a non-insured driver. So I'd like you to put yourself in Louise's shoes. What changes that we were just talking about in terms of physical changes, emotional changes, mental behavior changes would you predict you might see if you were in Louise's shoes? So some of the physical symptoms would be shallow breathing, racing heart. He might not be sleeping very well. He might start having back pains or stomach pains, might having a lot of headaches, digestive problems, feeling really tired, like he couldn't concentrate, feeling like his heart was racing. So it's really interesting because how we externalize our stress in our bodies is actually something that we've learned in our families. If you think about your family or your case, like sometimes whole family systems will have back problems, or other families will tend to have digestive problems. In my family, it's canker sores. When we're stressed, we get canker sores. Emotional signs of cumulative stress. Thinking about Louise, with all of those things happening, he might feel anxiety, he might feel frustrated, he might start having some mood swings where he would be feeling like, okay, I can't do this, and now like I have to do this, oh, I can do this. He might start having some nightmares, feeling depressed, feeling irritable, feeling like he wanted to cry. All of those would be emotional signs of chronic stress. What about mental signs? Like I said, he might start forgetting things. His job performance might go really, really down. He might start feeling really negative at work, like nobody cares about me, so why should I care about them? He might therefore lose motivation. He might start talking to himself in a much more negative way. Some people could even start having paranoid thoughts when they're really, really stressed, like the world's out to get me, I don't know if I can trust anybody. So that's something to be really aware of. In terms of your behavior, many people who work in stressful situations will say that they have a very noticeable increase in their alcohol or drug use or tobacco use. So that's a sure sign to look for if you're feeling some stress, that this might be chronic stress. Another one is changes in eating habits, eating behaviors. So some people stop eating and lose a lot of weight. Some people eat a lot. It just really depends on your system. Changes in sexual behavior, like shutting down on your libido or actually taking lots of risk with your sexuality. Another thing that happens with cumulative stress is that you avoid certain things. So let's think about Louise again. He might really just avoid his supervisor, right? Because that's a source of stress. He's giving him negative feedback, and he might just like avoid being in the same room with him, avoid looking at him. All of that is a sign of stress. In terms of relationships, things that can happen with ongoing stress is marriage problems, or you withdraw from your social circle. You don't feel like going out. You just want to stay home. You start feeling really lonely, therefore. You can start feeling resentful or even impatient or intolerant of others. And then I also want to look at belief systems, because we as human beings really need to have a sense of meaning in our lives. And however that looks and however you do that, that also changes when we've had too much stress. So we start feeling empty. We might start doubting our religious beliefs. We might lose our sense of purpose. Or we might need to work. We feel like we need to work to prove our self-worth. Or we might just start feeling really cynical, like, oh, what's the point? It's not worth it. One dynamic that I want to, just really highlight is when stress happens in a group. So Let's think about Luis and his NGO working on landmine victims. If that supervisor treats many people in this unkind, disrespectful way, there could probably be a dynamic at work that would look like where people lose the initiative to perform well. They might feel really angry a lot of the time, and they would form like a clique or a clique of people that say like, okay, we don't want to talk to those people, and so there's an us and them mentality. Oftentimes in a work setting with a lot of stress, there's very high staff turnover, and colleagues don't really trust each other. There's a lot of criticizing of each other, and there's a lot of scapegoating, like, that's not my fault, that's your fault. So all of that are symptoms of stress, so not very nice. Like Louise, a lot of people who work in situations where they're in helping roles can develop over time something that we call compassion fatigue. And that means that people who are meant to be dealing with other people's problems start feeling really tired. They start feeling like, I don't want to be listening to these people. I don't want to be helping. No matter what I do, it never helps. Like that, like the problems start feeling insurmountable, and they develop compassion fatigue. If we go back to that stress curve, right at the end of the stress curve was the burnout, right? And burnout then is when there's a very long-term amount of stress and you're overworked and you're facing lots and lots of very high expectations and feeling like you've been a disappointment. You're not able to maintain your self-care. You're not maintaining your social support network. And it gets to a point where all you can do actually is to take a break and rest, because if not, you will have a breakdown. And this characteristic of burnout, this phenomenon of burnout, seems to be happening more and more in our lives and in our world. And so I just want you to ask yourself if you know anybody that you think that is suffering from burnout, or do you think that you have suffered from burnout? To talk more about burnout, I want to look at the differences between this questionnaire, which is a work self-assessment questionnaire on stress. And Adam's put that up on the screen. Thanks, Adam. So just look at the different questions on that. I feel tense and nervous. My work no longer interests me. I have difficulty in sleeping. I have bad dreams or nightmares. I'm spending more time at work than I want to or should. So that is, if you think about chronic stress, this is what is going to evaluate chronic stress. And you can take this exam. It's easy to find on the web. And just look at the score. So above 36, you're under severe stress, and you need to ask for help. That's an important thing to do, is that when you're really stressed or burnt out, it's no longer within your coping capacities, and you really need outside help. Looking at this next instrument, which again comes from Headington, is asking about signs of burnout. So just noticing the difference in the questions being asked. A lot of the questions, as you see, are the same. What the differences are in this questionnaire, they look more at the sense of meaning, right? I feel like I can't solve the problems assigned to this work. I feel like my work is insignificant or it doesn't make a difference. I feel unappreciated. So all the meaning about who I am and what I'm doing is changed when you're in a state of burnout. So I think talking about stress is really, really important, because things can go really wrong when we don't pay attention to our stress levels. And I want to give you a personal example. When I lived in South Africa, I helped to set up an HIV/AIDS project in an inner city church in Pretoria. And so the church project, we were giving food parcels out. We had an outreach to the local hospital, and we had people coming into the office for testing. And my apartment was just above this project. And for the most part, it worked, not having a lot of separation between my work and life. But after a while, I noticed that sense of responsibility, like this problem will never be fixed, I can never do enough, got more intense for me. And one day it became really clear that I was heading for burnout. Just across the street from where I lived and worked was a park where there was a lot of people who were gay male prostitutes. And there was also a lot of drug use. And a lot of those gay male prostitutes were HIV positive, as you can imagine. And one day I was locking up the office at 8 o'clock at night, and these two guys come in from across the street from the park and say, hi, Heidi, can we have some food parcels? So instead of just saying, like, are you going to use those food parcels to sell in order to use drugs, or do you actually need a food parcel? I just started scolding them. I'm like, can't you see that I just turned off my light? And I just started talking to them in that way. And I really surprised myself because I'm like, okay, Heidi, you have a roof over your head. You're taken care of. These guys are pretty much homeless. They're working as sex workers. They're HIV positive, and their life is pretty stressful. And they're asking you for help, and you're scolding them. And at that point, I realized that the amount of stress that I was carrying was right at the edge. I don't think I could have carried it much more. And in fact, I needed to take some time off, which I did in a few months after that incident. So it's really important to look at stress because we want to take responsibility for ourselves, for our health, and for our well-being. Otherwise, we just perpetuate these cycles of stress, and we create stress in other people's lives, like I'm sure I did that night. Going back to the things that you wrote earlier, the 5 things that you're finding stressful, I want to think about the things that we've just talked about. The positive stress, the basic stress, the cumulative stress, the compassion to fatigue, and the burnout. And I want you to take a minute or two and write down your answers, like where would you place the things that are stressing you out right now in those categories? All right. So as you're writing down your answers, I just want to tell you what next we're going to look at how stress affects our bodies and our brains. We had a question about how stress affects us in terms of culture change and acculturation. And I'm sorry, Mohammed, we're not going to be talking about acculturation change, but it's definitely a huge part of what creates stress, is having to adapt to new routines, new ways of thinking, new ways of being doing things that are normal for you. So, but we're not going to be talking about it this time in this webinar today. But before we talk about how stress affects our bodies and our brains, I want us to just take a little time to just stretch a little, because another thing that is actually stressful is inactivity, right? And it's not normal. It's not something that feeds us for us to be still too long. So just, if you can take a second and just stretch in your chair there before we go on, you're helping yourself take care of yourself and doing some self-care. So we're going to talk about the limbic system. The limbic system regulates our mood, and it has several structures, which include the thalamus. And the thalamus is our sensory relay system. So our taste, our sight, our sound, our touch, but not our smell. All of that information comes in through our sensory cortex and gets into our thalamus, where it's read as, like, where should this piece of information go? Does it go to the neocortex? Does it go to the amygdala? where does that information go? The amygdala is what processes emotions and is connected to our anger, our violence, our aggression, our fear, and our anxiety. And our amygdala is connected to smell, because if you think about our fear center right in the middle of our brain, the limbic system sits just under the neocortex. So that's where our fear, our aggression, our anxiety comes from. If we start smelling something that lets us know we're in danger, it goes right to the amygdala so we can react even faster. Like, for instance, smoke. The next structure that's in the limbic system is the hippocampus, and that is involved in memory formation. It's like an early storage unit for long-term memory before it goes into permanent memory. And then the other structure is the hypothalamus, and that is what activates our autonomic nervous system, the fight-flight mode that you've heard of, as well as the rest and digest mode. So it takes care of which one we're in. The hypothalamus is the cornerstone of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, the HPA axis. And we'll talk about more of that just now. So the HPA axis is involved in producing hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. And the hypothalamus is also involved in regulating blood pressure, body temperature, hunger, thirst, and sleep. And if you think about what we talked about in terms of stress, all of those get disturbed when we have too much stress in our system, which means we have too much cortisol. Because if the information that's coming through our senses is perceived as dangerous or threatening, then the hypothalamus sends a signal down to your pituitary gland at the bottom of your brain, and it tells it to release something that travels through your bloodstream, stimulates your adrenal cortex, and produces cortisol, which is also known as a stress hormone. And it's this which then prepares our body. It constricts our digestive system and our blood flow and allows us to be ready to fight, to confront any danger, or to flee, to run away, or to withdraw from danger. Under normal circumstances, several minutes after a threatening situation is over, whether real or imagined, the fight or flight response subsides and the body relaxes and it returns to its normal status. So the heart rate comes down, the blood pressure comes down, our breathing relaxes, our muscles relax, our digestion starts working again, and our immune system all return to normal. And studies actually show that short-term stress actually boosts our immune system because it gears us up to meet and overcome a challenge such as an injury or an infection within ourselves. However, when stress is chronic, that HPA axis that I talked about becomes damaged. And this can result in chronically high cortisol levels, and it leads to lots of different negative symptoms. Weight gain, mood swings, poor sleep, short attention span, memory issues. It can also affect your blood pressure and the fats in your blood, making it more likely that you'll have a heart attack or a stroke. Elevated levels of cortisol also have this domino effect that hardwires how information gets processed in the amygdala. So instead of being able to evaluate whether information is threatening or non-threatening, the amygdala starts seeing all this information coming through as dangerous. That tells me I'm in danger. So then we get caught in this vicious cycle where our brains become predisposed to a constant state of fight or flight. So have you ever met anybody who's just really hyper vigilant, like, what? No. And they startle very easily? That's telling you that their amygdala is not functioning well. That ability to discern, like, yes, I'm in danger, or I'm in a state of threat, whether imagined or real, or actually, no, I can relax, I can let down. That function goes away when there's too much cortisol in our system. Too much cortisol also can damage and kill cells in the hippocampus, which regulates our memory and our emotions. Under extended periods of acute stress, the hippocampus can actually get smaller. And in children that have grown up in abusive homes, they've actually seen, when they've done brain scans, that the hippocampus is smaller than normal for children their age. And remember that one of the symptoms that tells us that we might be heading for burnout is forgetfulness. And that's because our hippocampus doesn't work as well, because those cells are actually dying faster than they need to be dying. Raised levels of cortisol also for prolonged periods also causes too much wear and tear on our immune system, which can break down and lead to illness. In fact, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in the U.S. estimates that stress accounts for 75% of all doctor's visits. That's a really good statistic to pay attention to in terms of what we're going to talk about a little later in terms of self-care. One way to avoid going to the doctor as much is to really increase your commitment to your own self-care. Just to finish up, though, on these raised cortisol levels and the chronic stress, another thing that it does is it reduces our levels of neurotransmitters, especially serotonin and dopamine, which are what help us to stay calm, what help us to stay regulated. And if you know anybody who's depressed, those two neurotransmitters play a significant role in people who are depressed when you don't have enough serotonin. And like I just said, there's also evidence that chronic stress causes premature brain aging and decreases the actual number of brain cells. And I want us to watch just a little piece of this TED Ed video that explains exactly what's happening. Adam's going to put that on. Thanks.
Too much of it results in the loss of synaptic connections between neurons and the shrinking of your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that regulates behaviors like concentration, decision-making, judgment, and social interaction. It also leads to fewer new brain cells being made in the hippocampus. This means chronic stress might make it harder for you to learn and remember things, and also set the stage for more serious mental problems like depression and eventually Alzheimer's disease. The effects of stress may filter right down to your brain's DNA. An experiment showed that the amount of nurturing a mother rat provides its newborn baby plays a part in determining how that baby responds to stress later in life. The pups of nurturing moms turned out less sensitive to stress because their brains developed more cortisol receptors, which stick to cortisol and dampen the stress response. The pups of negligent moms had the opposite outcome, and so became more sensitive to stress throughout life. These are considered epigenetic changes, meaning that they affect which genes are expressed without directly changing the genetic code. And these changes can be reversed if the moms are swapped. But there's a surprising result. The epigenetic changes caused by one single mother rat were passed down to many generations of rats after her. In other words, the results of these actions were inheritable. It's not all bad news, though. There are many ways to reverse what cortisol does to your stressed brain. The most powerful weapons are exercise and meditation, which involves breathing deeply and being aware and focused on your surroundings. Both of these activities decrease your stress and increase the size of the hippocampus, thereby improving your memory. So don't feel defeated by the pressures of daily life. Get in control of your stress before it takes control of you.
From the video, we see that it's really important not only for our own selves, but for generations that come after us, for us to work on reducing our levels of stress. Epigenetics is a really interesting and fascinating field, and I encourage you to do some Googling on that, because We're not going to have time to talk about it today, but it's really, really an interesting part of study and research in psychology these days. One of the things that we have discovered also recently is how plastic or how changeable our brains are over our lifetime. So it's really important to keep learning and keep doing new things to keep our brains really, really fluid, and because that also really helps in maintaining our capacity to respond better to stress. And we can improve our brains by consciously making daily choices that help us recover from the negative consequences of stress. Maintaining regular routines of self-care play a really important part of how we manage stress. So as we talk about self-care techniques, I want you to write down, and if you can, write in what helps you maintain balance and regulate your levels of stress when you're there. So one of the things that is really important to do is to eat well, to not eat too many carbohydrates, not too much sugar, to get enough sleep, to exercise regularly. Like I said in the little video, having a meditation or mindfulness practice really helps, because a lot of times when we're stressed, we go way into the future or we stay in the past and we're not here in the present, which is really important in terms of just staying like this today I can cope with, right? Drinking lots of water. We're made most of water, so kind of keeping ourselves hydrated. Limiting the use of alcohol and tobacco. Being in nature or outdoors is another way to participate in self-care. Making sure that you have downtime, leisure time, doing some hobbies, staying in touch with family and loved ones, learning new things, like I just said. And when you're in this place where you're beyond what you can cope with, reaching out for help. It could be professional help, or it could be, from somebody that you deeply trust and who can help you through something because they've been there beforehand. And if you have a spiritual practice, maintaining that. All of those are really important parts of self-care. For the rest of today, though, I really want to focus on sleep, because a lot of times things start to unravel when our sleep goes away. Getting a full night's sleep every night is really important. And I don't know about you, but if I don't have a full night's sleep, I really feel it the next day. I might have a hard time staying focused, staying alert. I might get cranky, more impatient, more irritable. And that just happens after one bad night, right? But if you're regularly losing sleep, if you have insomnia, there's serious physical and mental health issues that look very much what we've been looking at in terms of chronic stress that can happen when you don't get enough sleep. So you can be at risk for heart disease, for stroke, for diabetes, for memory loss, for arrhythmia in your heart, for depression, and also a likelihood of accidents because you're not as alert, you're not as aware. So what are some of the things that work to get us to sleep? We're going to look at that because sleep problems create stress at work and home, and because when you're stressed out, it makes it harder for you to sleep, because then you get anxious, right? Like, oh, I'm not going to go to sleep. Sleep dysregulation happens around 3 different kinds of ways. Nightmares, ongoing nightmares, having a problem falling asleep, or having a problem going back to sleep because you wake up during the middle of the night. So I'm going to talk about some things that I've used that I know work for me, and I'd like you to write in if, as I'm going over these, have you found anything that has been effective in you getting to sleep, getting back to sleep, or getting really good regular sleep? So I want to go over one exercise with you that I've shared with lots of clients in my time as a therapist. It's called the stair visualization. I want you to imagine that you're at the top of a flight of stairs, and as you look down these flight of stairs, you tell yourself, when I get to the bottom of the stairs, I will fall asleep. And then you take a long, slow breath in, And as you exhale, you count backwards from 10 to 1, and you visualize taking one step down with each number that you count backwards from. It might also help to picture the texture of the stairs and feel that under your feet as you imagine walking down the stairs. Take another slow breath in and continue counting. When you get to the 5th stair, you repeat to yourself, when I get to the bottom of these stairs, I will fall asleep. If you notice your mind starting to wander as you're doing this in bed, trying to get to sleep, you just gently come back to the visualization of the stairs and continue counting from where you left off before your mind wandered away. And then if you get to the bottom of the stairs, tell yourself, I will now fall asleep. I often don't get to the bottom of the stairs because I'm asleep by then. So that seems to work much better than counting sheep. Another thing to do is to have like an iPod player or some kind of music, an MP3 player, because if you are having nightmares, you need to have something that soothes you, because your whole body will be reacting as though it's in threat. And so you need to help soothe yourself. So listening to some very soft, gentle music is one way to do it. Another way to do it is putting a hand on your forehead and one on your diaphragm and just feeling the comfort of that, holding those two places on your body. And focus on the gentle rising and falling of your stomach as you breathe. Another thing that I like to do is put a pillow over my head, and that way I can actually listen to my heartbeat, which is a really, really comforting sound for us humans to do. Like babies like to lie against chest because they're listening to the sound of heartbeat, which is a very soothing rhythm for all of us. One thing to do to empty your mind, if you notice that your mind is going through like just racing thoughts, is to take each thought, visualize taking each thought, and in your mind putting it in a body of water like a pond or a river, and just letting it go. And so if more thoughts that disturb you or make you anxious come up, just take them out and then just put them in the stream, the river, the lake, whatever it is, and let it go. And just focus on your breathing as you do that. Some people practice emotional freedom technique, which again you can Google and look online, and that's a really good way to calm your whole system down before going to sleep, or even in bed when you wake up and you can't get back to sleep. One thing that's kind of unusual to do, that actually I think works well, is if you can't get back to sleep, you turn around 180 degrees in your bed so your head is where your feet were, and somehow, not sure why, that also helps to put yourself back to sleep. One last thing I'll mention around getting back to sleep is binaural sounds. So that's sounds that have different frequencies. And again, that's something that you can Google. It's very freely available on YouTube. And the frequencies in our brain when we're in a very deeply relaxed state are very, very low. And so what the binaural sound does is it creates two frequencies which our brains then cancel out to create that delta or theta wave that then puts us into a much more deeply relaxed and sleepy state. So it's binaural, B-I-N-A-U-R-A-L, binaural sounds or binaural beats. So look that up if you have a chance. The other thing that you can do is Google sleep hygiene, and there's lots and lots of information on the web on sleep hygiene with lots of do's and don'ts, and I'll let you look that up. Things like, avoid exercise, avoid doing something strenuous before going to sleep, avoid things that kind of get you riled up. But there's lots of information on sleep hygiene. So around self-care, Adam's going to now put a self-care technique instrument on the screen. And I'd like you to just look at that and see if you what your score is as you look at the questions. And if you can write in and tell us what your score is around your capacity for self-care. It's just self-care inventory. We'll just take a second and do that. And then we're going to end today with a relaxation exercise. Because one of the things that I haven't talked about, other than sleep, which is a very, very common thing to do to help reduce stress, is just taking a few deep breaths. So Adam's going to put a really soothing image up on the screen of, and you can keep your eyes open or closed, however you feel comfortable. And we're going to work on something which is a very useful relaxation exercise, which will help us feel calmer, less anxious, and less than any other symptom of stress you might be having. So sit with your feet in your chair comfortably and with your feet well connected to the floor, and allow your body muscles to be relaxed as possible. Let your chair or your couch or wherever you're sitting just really take the full weight of your body. And I invite you to just breathe in really slowly without forcing, as if you're inhaling through a straw or a flute, while counting from 1 to 5 until your lungs are filled. And very briefly, when you get to 5, hold your breath. And then very slowly breathe out without forcing anything, again blowing through a straw and counting down from 5 to 1. So pause briefly when your lungs are empty and do it again. Breathing in, counting to 5, holding your breath just a little bit, breathing out, counting backwards, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, resting just a little bit with your lungs empty, and then breathing in again. How does that feel? I'm feeling calmer. So I gave you that image of the tree, but you can imagine something beautiful while you're doing that. You can imagine whatever soothes you, comforts you, gives you a sense of relaxation. Mountains, lakes, beaches, whatever it is that makes you feel relaxed as you breathe in and breathe out. So that's the final technique that we're doing today. And I just want to thank you again for joining us on this webinar. And now is our time for questions. So if you have any questions, please write them in, and Adam will get them here to me and we can talk about them. Thanks so much. The other thing is that the email addresses that I told you I would give you, we're going to put online. So if you wanted to contact the Global Initiative for Stress and Trauma Treatment, their email's there, and my email at UNITAR is there. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I wish you well, and I look forward to seeing you in our Part 2 webinar on Tuesday, June 27th at the same time. Bye-bye.